Thanks, Meg, and let me just add my welcome as well. I noticed in the program that at the end of the day, Ken Cameron is going to share with us some reflections on Peter Oberlander. When I was thinking about this panel, I've been looking forward to it for a long time. I thought Peter would enjoy this conversation. I had the pleasure of working with Peter a number of years and writing things with him. He always insisted on a history lesson at the beginning and multiple maps. I know a lot about the flood of 1948. What can I say? Let me briefly introduce, I think what we'll do is I'll introduce all three of the panel, and they're going to go in the order they're here nearest to me. The first up here is Harold Steeves. Harold wears a lot of hats. He wears them all well and passionately. He is a Richmond councillor. He's a director of the GVRD. He's a farmer. He's a former MLA. He was in the House at the time that the Agricultural Land Reserve was established, and he's been a lifelong advocate for that. He has good bona fides to be so. He's an Aggie from UBC. He's say a farmer and lives on the family farm in Steveston, named after his family, one of the first European settlers in the area, and has been involved in things regionally back to the Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board we were just talking about as we were coming in. So Harold will lead us off on this discussion, and I've suggested at the end that there might be a moment left if I shut up here quickly to get beyond the 50-year history and make a few comments about what next. So that's Harold. I mentioned Peter Oberlander. I think the first time I met Rick Hankin, I was hauled by Peter out to GVRD headquarters to meet Rick and talk about regional parks. And Rick's association with the region and the contributions to the region are part of the living legacy. When Rick began with parks, he's a planner by background. There were, I think, 4 or 5 parks in the system, and now there's about 25, although there's some discussion about returning some of them back to municipalities. Maybe Rick will have a word on that. The third person here on our panel is Joy MacPhail. Joy also has a history of wearing multiple hats. I was trying to count, I lost track of the number of ministries you were minister of. Was it 8 or 9?
Yeah.
4 9. 4 premiers?
3.
Just 3. Okay. Dan Miller?
Oh, 4, you're right.
Dan Miller was in there, you forgot. How soon we forget. Yeah. Okay, so that's and some important portfolios, finance and health and others. And one of Joy's contributions to the region was something that people had long sought, which was a recognition that land use planning would go well with transportation planning. And so the creation of the original TransLink. We're going to hear a little bit later from the minister responsible for the current TransLink. There might be an opportunity for some dialogue around that. Anyway, that's enough for me. Let me turn things over to Harold Steeves to lead us off, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that follows. Harold.
Well, thank you very much. In addition to all that, I delivered a calf at midnight last night, so it's been a long night. I'm just going to tell a little bit about the history of the ALR. We went through a number of phases, and I hope this works. The first phase, it doesn't work. Okay. I got the first picture up.
Deepak, can you just reload it? Please?
There we go. First, we had the First Nations. This was a very rich area, and we had an introduction earlier. The fishery was phenomenal. Oops, we skipped one. Anyway, this was the areas where the fish were found in the whole region. Basically, there were sloughs and streams everywhere. Oh, no, this is it. On the mud flats, there was acres and acres of clams. The pioneers came, they plowed the fields, they diked the land, they planted oats in the fields to feed their cattle, grew hay, rotated their crops. There's the cows, that's our farm. And they planted root crops and vegetables for the city. We had LRT, this is the one that ran across Richmond to Steveston. The farmers lined up their wagons loads of milk and milk cans for the LRT, for the trams, and the same with the trams going up to Chilliwack. Shipped the milk to Vancouver where it was bottled, and delivered it to the city people. That's one of my great uncles. We had a dairy in Vancouver in 1912. We had schools that taught agriculture at the time. Everybody learned agriculture, planted a garden. We had experimental farms that have all been closed down, Oyster River, Colony Farm, Agassiz still there. World War II, we planted victory gardens. This is our family, my uncle's horse. He plowed all the streets of Steveston so that people could come out and plant vegetables along the roadside. We grew 42% of our food in victory gardens in Canada and the US. In World War II, food was rationed. Be prepared for that to happen again. This is what Richmond looked like. We had a rice mill, and the rest of it was vast acreages of farmland. There's Barnston Island and Surrey, again, vast acreages of farmland. I was a student at UBC in 1955 to about 1959, and this became the topic of conversation. Dr. Sverre Pedersen, the world's top climatologist, told us that the climate was changing, and we worried about how it would affect agriculture as the desertification happened across the world. He said the ice cap would be melting by 2007, and he was right on. Well, we didn't worry about it too much. That's the bridge from Richmond to Vancouver, and we complained about the traffic, and I used to use that as an excuse when I was late for class. We had about 20 cars lined up, probably. So we replaced it with a bridge, 1957, a huge bridge that was much greater than we needed because this was a farm area. But in 1959, Richmond Council changed all of that, and one night in council, they rezoned half of Richmond, 12,000 acres, and 1,000 small farms were zoned from agriculture to residential and industry. And we were told that the reason they were doing this was because it was easier to put housing on farmland than to build on the mountaintops in North Vancouver. We also lost all our processors. Empress Jams, Nally's Pickles, they all went out of business and left because the small farms were the ones that produced the strawberries and the cucumbers. This is what Richmond looked like at the time. This is what Richmond looked like after it changed. And here it is today, that area. And then we built the tunnel, provided 500 jobs for 2 years, but the same thing happened. And this is the Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board discussed this plan in 1968. They decided against it, and the provincial government fired the planning board and created the GVRD without planning powers. So that's how we all began. Well, in 1972, the government changed, and Jim Lorimer, the Minister of Municipal Affairs, looked into LRT to go to White Rock because we did not want to create an additional bridge or additions to the tunnel to see the farmland go the way it had gone when the tunnel was built and when the bridge was built. When Bill Vanderzam was elected, he said, instead of it going to White Rock, the first route, we'll send the first route to Surrey, but the next route would be to Richmond. The Richmond route only got to downtown Richmond, but not to the tunnel. 28% of our farms were gone. We were losing 10,000 acres a year. Only 1% of BC grows vegetables. And we were very concerned, so we brought in the Agricultural Land Reserve. We set up allotment gardens on what's now Fantasy Gardens. We provided income assurance to the farmers because they thought that their pensions were gone because they put their money in the farms. They wanted to sell the farms, and it worked. Up to date now, we've got a drought in California. 60 to 70% of our food or vegetables comes from California, and it's a major drought. Extreme drought, they call it. 500 acres last year were too dry to plant. But they're predicting that we're going to go from extreme drought to mega drought by 2050. Well, one of the things that the Agricultural Land Reserve did was we had a land bank, and it was called Provincially Supported Agriculture. And basically, we have now changed this to municipally supported agriculture in my area. And Richmond has 3 major areas that were acquired over the years, the Terra Nova lands, which I've got pictured here. We met with United Nations officials at the last Habitat Forum in Vancouver, and I forgot to mention earlier, I made a presentation to Habitat 76 on the issue, and they adopted the idea of saving farmland, but it didn't work very well. In Canada, it was only the Parti Québécois that supported us and saved farmland in Quebec, and very few other countries did it. And the UN officials said that we'd saved our farmland, would we set up a farm school? And so we set the farm school up at the Terra Nova lands. And we've established incubator farms, and the idea is to teach people how to go farming again, to how to plant their victory gardens. And this is some of the plots at Terra Nova. We have greenhouses and a new barn for the Food Security Society that provides food for the food bank. And we even have a playground. And we're opening up one of the sloughs that the First Nations used to have a village on at Terra Nova Slough to bring the salmon back again. We do three things in our parks there. We have recreation, we provide food, and we also provide energy. This is the Terra Nova Slough. This is the Garden City lands. 136 acres, we're starting to develop that land in August. That's the Garden City lands today. And this is Fantasy Gardens, and it's no longer a fantasy. We've renamed it and called it the Gardens. Unfortunately, the highway is going to take a huge chunk of it, which we had not anticipated. The plans for the bridge at Massey Bridge weren't supposed to be a bridge, and Kevin Falcon in 2006 announced he was going to add 2 lanes to the tunnel, and it was going to cost, you see underlined at the bottom corner there, $500 million to do so. That plan changed. The same thing as the Agricultural Land Reserve changed. And they set up a zoning system, a zone in the interior which allows fracking, a lot of other things. And in this region, they recommended to allow a lot of non-farm uses like meaderies and I call them pot bunkers because they're huge buildings for growing pot that have to be fortified against gangsters. And so we've had a problem in the region with that. Now in Richmond, we basically have managed to convince all the ones that want to have breweries and potteries and everything else to go in the industrial zone, but we are actually contrary to the new act, which allows them to go in on the farmland. Most of them don't want to go to the farmlands, which is a good thing. Well, we're back again. Richmond Council is opposing the bridge for the same reason that we were concerned about the bridge or what happened to the bridge when it was built from Oak Street to Richmond and the tunnel to Delta in the first place. We see a huge land grab in the future from farmland. And so Richmond is opposing it. We'd like the tube with 2 lanes and rapid transit that was promised. The port wants to have coal shipping, jet fuel, and even liquefied natural gas. This one was turned down by the Tsawwassen First Nation, but there's others proposed on the river. And I put this little quote in. People say, oh no, it's got nothing to do with the port. Well, Robin Sylvester emailed to the provincial government in 2014 and asked his staff to provide the information, what is the air draft of the largest length LNG vessel that we could imagine in the river? And thanks are. And the answer is, for a bridge, the air draft would be about 61 meters to allow the larger part of the world's LNG fleet under 300 to 320 meters to enter the Fraser. And if you put a new tunnel in, you have to dredge to a depth of 15.5 meters. This will change the entire Fraser River estuary, and the port wants 2,500 acres of farmland as backup. This is the port lands in Richmond, and you see all the little squares around there are 220 acres that have already been purchased by the port. Paddy owns land, there's other lands that others own, and they're all hoping to add it to the port with this expansion. And then we got this New Coast Realty you've heard about in Vancouver that's flipping houses. Well, they're going around telling people, buy farmland because you'll be able to convince local councils in the future to rezone the land and you'll make a lot of money. Then we got the Site C Dam, and that may be an odd one to have here, but we're trying to deal with that in Metro Vancouver as well. 30,000 acres, enough to feed 1 million people, or 10,000 jobs for 10 years, 1,000 jobs for 10 years. I just put that one on for the fun of it. We've looked at it from UBC, and with solar rooftop power, we can generate enough power for 900,000 homes, and we don't need Site C, and we can save our farmland. We can actually have biogas on farms and cities, and we're doing it in Metro Vancouver, in Richmond already, with anaerobic digesters to create electricity and compost to go onto the farmland, the parks, and the fields, and the gardens. And in Richmond, we're doing geothermal power, which eliminates the need for electric baseboard heaters in the new apartment buildings. Well, in conclusion, I just want to say that the only class 1 to 3 soils with high crop capabilities in BC are the alluvial soils along the Peace and Fraser rivers, and the maritime climate soils of southern Vancouver Island, where they're one climatic zone warmer than anywhere else in Canada. They are also the only soils that aren't threatened by a lack of water and drought, because they've got, of course, the rivers to feed them. And all these areas are threatened. In conclusion, this is our own farm, and we're the ones that are doing experimental work. That's an experiment in tomatoes, and we've got a variety of tomatoes that works well in our climate, will grow well in the Peace River. They're ripe. There's about 4 or 5 rows of tomatoes in that picture. They're ripened 2 or 3 weeks before any other variety. In fact, we have ripe tomatoes when the other varieties are blooming. We can feed people in British Columbia. We don't have to rely on the United States. When the ALR was brought in, we were producing 86% of our vegetables. It's 43% now. If we save our farmland, we can feed ourselves once again. These are my girls. One of them had a baby last night, and they say thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Harold, for helping to set the table for our discussion. I'm going to move right on to our second presenter and have all 3 with the ideas on the table, and then we'll open it up. So, Rick, it's all yours.
Well, I think the regional park story is a really interesting one. I may be prejudiced, of course, but it had its beginnings, as best I can detect, back in the 50s and 60s when outdoor recreation absolutely exploded. Between 52 and 58, outdoor recreation use at the 4 provincial parks available within the Lower Fraser Valley, Lower Mainland, quadrupled. This was driven by population growth, increased leisure time. At that time, my mother still worked a 44-hour week, and I think my father a 50-hour week. But it was changing. There was increased income mobility. All of these factors were multiplier effects on each other. It led to the Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board, which not many people know anything about, but it has a storied history, and it's worth study if you're serious about the development of government in this region. In any event, in '56, I pleaded with the province to drop its prohibition on putting any provincial parks within organized territories, within municipal boundaries, because it was quite clear that proximity of parks to people had a tremendous impact on the level of use and the resulting benefits of that use. But most of the provincial parks were up towards Squamish or up beyond Hope, those that existed. There's been a tremendous change in that, but a key part of that report was the municipalities are too fractious to get their act together and be able to collaborate on land purchase and provision of services on that land. So there was a whole series of plans and studies. There was a Metropolitan Joint Commission under Hugo Ray, 1958-59, and the LRMPB did a proposed Metropolitan Parks Plan for the Commission as part of its examinations. A provincial report around 1960 showed a continuing huge increase in what they call regional park use, and by that they defined use within the region, not level of government. And we're pointing at all kinds of needs, many of them lands owned within municipalities, but other Crown provincial lands as well. I think this frightened the province. It's hard to detect how much altruism there was in the adoption of the Regional Parks Act in 1965 and how much self-preservation. I know, talking to the Deputy Minister of the time, they were scared to death of the demand for recreation by 50% of the province's population gathered right around us. Only 600,000 people at that time. Look at the change today. So in any event, whatever the motivation, the Regional Park Act came about. It allowed 2 or more municipalities to agree to form a regional park district. It would give them a carrot of 1/3 capital funding contributions to land acquisition and development. It allied the regional park district process with the new regional district process by adopting the same measures on how you calculate votes, numbers of directors, how you operate the governance part of regional districts or regional park districts. And it required in the first 5 years that 60% of funds would have to go to land acquisition. In fact, the Vancouver-Fraser Park District, now Metro Vancouver Parks, aimed at 90%. In light of what happened, a tremendously wise decision. So in 1965, the Lower Mainland Municipal Association, a loose collaboration, I think, of senior staff and elected people from the municipalities of the whole Lower Mainland, that's Hope to West Vancouver, asked the Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board to prepare a plan for a proposed regional park system. That plan was completed in May 1966. It was the most ambitious plan by far compared to any of the previous metropolitan park studies. It aimed at 2001 as a planning horizon, 35 years in the distance, and a population of 2.1 million people in the region, almost bang on. I don't know whether that's good luck or good planning, but one or the other. And it proposed a system of 40 parks, and regional trails, some of them existing parks like Stanley Park, others, of course, brand new. It clearly defined, though, one of the magical elements, I believe, of that plan was it clearly defined what the continuing role of municipalities and the provincial government in its park system would have to do. The concern was, are we carving out a clear gap that a regional park agency and a regional park system should fill? And I think one of the key elements of that was a success in defining that clearly. It went on to define what kinds of recreation the regional system should do and not do. One of the decisions was, no, we're not in the overnight camping business, we're not in the downhill skiing business, and at that time, cross-country skiing was only the pursuit of a few mad Norwegians, so that wasn't even a factor. It was, I think, a report any students of governance today should read again 40 years later, 50 years later, actually, because I think it hangs together a lot of things it didn't do, but it made clear why there should be regional parks, and that the park user area had to match the park paying area. If you didn't put the municipalities that had the money and the people together with the municipalities that had the land, it wouldn't happen. And so much of the regional park land bought clearly was south of the Fraser, which had the agricultural land, had been alienated years ago, whereas there were more mountain parks and Crown provincial land north of the Fraser. One thing, the Regional Planning Board staff was made a nuisance of themselves. The Vancouver-Fraser Park District had an inaugural meeting on the 30th of August, '67, Earl Adams, an alderman, NPA alderman from the city of Vancouver, within 5 minutes of the opening of that meeting, proposed the Vancouver-Fraser Park District disband and become a function of the new regional district, which wasn't even operational. Well, hell. All hell broke loose. Nobody understood what regional districts were. They hadn't read their park plans yet, many of them probably, and it really was a sad story. So come December 13th of that year, the Regional Planning Board under Vic Parker submitted a report. Here's what we think your provisional budget should be for 1968, and you've got till December 31st to adopt it, or you have no money for the ensuing year, and there are lands on offer that will go down the tube and be lost, or developments that will happen if you don't act. There are a number of other things, but I don't have time to go into, that probably cost Vic Parker a job later on, or one of the reasons it cost him a job anyway. Initially, only 13 municipalities joined, 4 of them from what became Doonie Alouette and Central Fraser Valley regional districts. And one of the problems with that, dropped the Vancouver-Fraser Park District, joined the Fraser-Burrard Regional District, which became GVRD and Metro Vancouver, was what do you do about those 4 municipalities? And they made clear, the Regional Planning Board, that there needed to be a federation of regional districts, but they had to be organized before they could take on and do anything. Meanwhile, action on regional park land purchase would be delayed. It was key that Vancouver, Burnaby, Richmond, and Surrey joined, in my view, of the 9 metropolitan area municipalities. If they weren't in, hell, Vancouver was putting up better than 40% of the annual tax levy. It wouldn't have happened. And why Vancouver agreed to do that, I credit a number of people. Council had to. Stuart LaFaux with Vancouver City Parks probably was a factor, but I don't know for sure. As the program continued, other municipalities joined, and by 1972, all 22 municipalities, including the 4 outlying municipalities, were part of the function. One of the weaknesses long-term was that the regional plan and the new Vancouver-Fraser Park District did not include municipalities east of the Vedder River. It was deemed, and I think wisely, that you had to focus on the area where the real urban pressures were, and they weren't there yet, though they're there now, or getting there. In any event, picking up that job never really happened. It's not too late, but it's still to be done. Some of the achievements, oh good, that map is up. That's a regional park system and regional greenways. 26 regional parks and regional park reserves, 2 ecological reserves, Burns Bog being by far the biggest, and 5 regional greenways in the process of development. 7 parks designated as potential regional parks remain municipal. Stanley Park, I don't even know, as having been born and raised in Vancouver, that I would have voted for having Vancouver turn over Stanley Park to GVRD, as it turned out. And 1 became a provincial park, and 2 BC Hydro recreation sites that were slated to become parks were developed by BC Hydro, a recreation function they didn't have at the time of the plan. So things change. The flexibility, but yet the focus on objectives and the mission, that was clear and was surprisingly strong. We lost 2 regional park sites. One is Roberts Bank Port, and maybe that's right, but 7 were added that weren't in the plan. Did it matter that the plan changed? No, what mattered was that action happened, that we be adaptable, we find ways to, as the changing emphasis on ecology and environmental protection developed, which was very low level. Greenpeace hadn't been thought of in 1965. It took a while. And so things change, and the emphasis has continued to change over time. Let me just say that, because time's short, I see a number of key strengths that were the success of the Regional Parks program. There was a great plan underlying it. It was a clear concept, a clear role. It was for affordable, and it happened early enough. Our first purchase in Campbell Valley Regional Park was that property that Vic Parker was so concerned about. Bruce McLean wanted it kept together. He was willing to sell 200 acres for $160,000. That's $800 an acre. It seemed a fair price then. Today it seems a bloody steal. And had it even been delayed 5 years, the consequences in the dollar cost, the number of new houses that would have gone in some parks, and the number of people that would have objected to be all of a sudden told, gee, your land would make a good park, would have made it tremendously much more difficult. 10 years later, you wonder whether you could have done it. The second strength system, and this may surprise you, were the elected people, the much maligned politicians. They had a clear sense of mission. I'm not saying there were never any blips and there was never any local angst and so on. There was, but nothing that threatened the whole effort. Look at the service record. Ann Hulbert of Port Moody served 18 years on the Regional Park Committee. Hell, it's hard to get elected to council for 18 years, and you have to want it to be on that committee. A number of other people, Don Lanscale, Gail Martin for a similar number of years, Coruscant Percival Smith from Richmond, Stella Jo Dean from North Vancouver, Judy Higginbottom from Surrey, Mae Brown from Vancouver, Don McDonald of White Rock, Jim Tunn. These all made major contributions, but there were another 120 people involved over that time span. Those were some of the longer serving. The third strength, and I can't emphasize this enough, particularly in a park and recreation function, was the three-way relationship developed between elected people, staff, and citizens. We worked at it. It was not always that way. In the early going, first of all, public input and consultation was an unknown thing. When the plan was developed, 5 to 10 years later, it would have been a different story, public hearings and so on all over the place. So there was little input on the plan. There was no effort to publicize it. And if you didn't publicize and it wasn't known, maybe you avoided enemies, but you didn't get any allies either. And to me, that was the bigger problem. Property acquisition was 90% of the effort, but everything was done in secret. So even a proposal for a zoo, a metropolitan zoo at Tynehead, was a secret study for 5 years. And when it emerged, it caused all kinds of problems, and it ran out of time. A, it didn't get well organized, the group behind it, but B, the tides were turning and the support for such a facility dissipated. And expropriation was a second resort, not the last resort, and that was going to get us into trouble sooner or later. If property owner once engaged in discussion of sale wouldn't settle within 10% of the appraised value, the tendency was to expropriate. That was arrogant, misleading, overlooked the time span, and given enough time, everybody moves. Sooner or later, they're a willing seller. But you have to wait and allow time, and if you ram it down people's throats, you don't have allies, but you have plenty of enemies. I think the municipalities have to be mentioned. It wasn't always smooth sailing with some municipalities at times because municipal councils are caught between landowners and their special interests, and in this case, the regional park district or the regional district trying to pursue parks. But by and large, most municipal lands wanted for the park system were contributed, and we never paid for land. The most we ever paid a municipality for land was $25. And we were adopting that position because the provincial crown lands were so key. While we were after more than 10,000 acres of private land, we were after, at that time, 15,000 acres of crown provincial land. So I'm going to, which button do I push here? Sorry.
This one?
That one?
Yeah.
Oh, good. That system of regional parks and trails has resulted in this. As population has grown at between 1.6 and 1.9% annually, the regional park use now is growing at around 5% annually. With densification and population growth and the proximity, just look at Derby Reach. If you know Northwest Langley, there was no residential area. There were farms, small holdings north of the freeway at 200th Street. There was no industrial park. Derby Reach was out in the sticks. Look at it today and look at the use of that site on a sunny Thursday afternoon. It's an incredible change for people like me that saw it when nobody knew where the hell Derby Reach was. Some of you still won't, but that's because you don't get out in the bush enough. There's an unfinished, so some of the future questions that I've got, I just want to actually show one other slide. God, I should have had a rehearsal. That's the button. This is the map today. If you put together regional parks, provincial parks, wildlife reserves, what we called town parks, the upper edge of the municipal park spectrum, something like, for instance, Queen's Park or Little Mountain, Queen Elizabeth in Vancouver. Those, we said, they would not attract people from 1 and 2 hours away, by and large, but regional parks would. But almost none of those sites existed with the exception of Stanley Park, Lighthouse Park, the beach parks at Chawasan, Crescent Beach, a small one at Boundary Bay, and I know there are other sites there. But one thing that happened was not only did the region do its job, so did the municipalities in the province. And the focus today, of course, has changed dramatically, more to conservation, environmental preservation, and so on. So a few questions. The unfinished job, what do we do about the Upper Fraser Valley? We now have 2, not 4 regional districts, and there is collaboration between the 2 regional districts, Metro Vancouver and Fraser Valley Regional District. But their predecessors, Dudney Alouette and so on, had 1/40 of the population. Basically, my interpretation is they did 1/40 of the job. They got 25-acre parks instead of 1,000-acre parks because that's what they could afford and manage. But the importance of the park user region extending from beyond Hope down into Washington State and up almost to Squamish, on which the regional park plan was based and funded. If we'd been able to cover the whole region, the work along the Fraser River between the Vetter Canal and Hope would have been quite different. It's still possible. It's going to cost more, but it'll cost more later. And I don't know what will happen there. George Pule, when he's still chair of the regional district, asked me one day, you know, Vancouver operates Stanley Park. Why can't the municipalities operate regional parks and, you know, simplify government? And I said, well, that's true. Some municipalities are capable, and as they grow and develop, they become more diversified in terms of their roles and capabilities. But in fact, it simply wouldn't happen in a municipality like Langley with 3.5 regional parks. Would Langley have ever bought 3.5 regional parks and then paid the cost to develop and operate? No way. And so I said to him then, you want to simplify the park system and governance? Create a Lower Mainland Park Authority, put provincial parks and wildlife areas, which after all are 95% used by metropolitan Vancouver residents anyway, together with regional parks, extend the boundary up, and then pursue the comprehensive project. Now, whether that was ever doable, it got some very preliminary discussion, didn't go too far, and maybe there's some other collaboration between the 2 regional districts that would do the job a different way. Experience the Fraser program, which is this concept with Metro Vancouver working on westerly areas and Fraser Valley, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure how well it's progressing in the upstream area. Plus, the two regional districts are sharing the protection of Sumas Mountain and working out a system. It's working. How well, I don't know, but it's better than nothing for sure. Greenways and multi-agency programs are going to be the name of the game. The regional trail system in the 66 plan was done when there were no municipal trails, there was no Trans-Canada Trail, there was no Centennial Trail. All of a sudden, in the late 90s, instead of it being planners' lines on a map, some of which I'd drawn and were meaningless, they were dotted lines on maps, became a reality. Surrey was all of a sudden developing trails through Newton, Whalley, Guildford, down to Boundary Bay. We had Tynehead Regional Park, we had Surrey Bend coming along, Derby Reach, all of these can be connected. And so different agencies are doing different parts of the job. I won't spend more time on that, but it'll be multiple agencies in a whole bunch of ways, because that's the reality in a highly governed region like this. Out in the sticks, in the more remote regional districts, the Department of Lands, the Department of Forests, and so on, are the government, by and large. But that doesn't work here, and that's one reason why I thought we would do a better job of dealing with the public and dealing with the service needs if regional and provincial parks and similar reserves were unified. I'm not leading a campaign for that, that was the thought at the time. Environmental pressures and change are leading to a couple of factors. The Regional Parks program now is highly into preserving environmental sites. There is not a lot of new large-scale recreation sites to but there is a considerable amount of environmental land and protection that can be done. Densification is going to be a huge factor. We will be pursuing interconnected open space and greenways, connecting major and minor sites and residential populations together. And I would still maintain that citizen involvement, citizen ethic is going to be crucial. You can put two idiots on bike, horseback, even little old ladies with brooms watching umbrellas watching birds, and destroy other users' pleasure on a trail by rudeness, by lack of attention. You could put 10 or 20 people on the same with a little care and respect for each other. Carrying capacity isn't unlimited, but carrying capacity will vary depending on how people use the facilities, and the impact on the landscape will vary. I fervently hope that the Park Association model that we developed in the latter years of multi-interest citizen groups coming in a quasi-self-governing position. The wonderful thing about citizen organizations, they're not bound by municipal boundaries. They're not bound by jurisdictional boundaries. We in regional parks couldn't attack a municipality because of their environmental policy that downstream would affect a park. But boy, citizens can do it. And if you want a well-governed region, engagement has to really mean something, not just a bit of information out. Aboriginal land claims, I'm going to end here, is one I don't have any great knowledge about, except it was not a factor at the time the plan was done. And up until the Supreme Court decisions that said it doesn't matter whether the public has bought back land that was third-party alienated, it's now public and it may be subject to Aboriginal rights and claims. And so co-management and maybe some devolution of powers to Aboriginal groups will happen, but my guess, and I'm not involved directly anymore, is that it's going to take some time to sort out, but there are some good examples around too. So anyway, that's my pitch from the guy who had the best job in the region for 25 years and loved it, and it's a fascinating story that everybody should share. Thank you.
I'm going to call on Joy, and I want to just thank you, Rick, Victor Jones, who taught at Berkeley for years and was a friend of Peter Oberlander's and spent some time in the Lower Mainland, once told me that the regional park system that you're so central in creating was the best example of metropolitan land use planning in all of North America. He wrote a book on metropolitan government in 1942, University of Chicago. He knew something about metropolitan government, and he was very full of high praise for your work. So the legacy of the parks, the legacy of the agricultural land reserve are very much part of the history of this region. And now we have Joy MacPhail to tell us about transportation and other things.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. And just as Richard is a passionate advocate for decades for the regional parks, and Harold has been a passionate advocate for decades for the agricultural land reserve, I am a passionate advocate of TransLink. I may be the only one, but I am. And I've been that for just 2 decades, because my involvement with TransLink started in 1996, when I was the minister responsible for BC Transit at the time, and a Lower Mainland MLA. I was the MLA for Vancouver Hastings. The concept of a regional transportation authority that involved both highways and roads and transit started long before TransLink, but really gelled in a document that was put together by the GVRD at the time, now Metro Vancouver, and the provincial government in 1993, called Transport 2021. And it was a visionary document. It was an agreed upon document at both the regional level and the provincial level. And it went nowhere. Stayed on the shelf, or was maybe analyzed by brilliant academics, but nothing happened. In fact, nothing happened on this file until 2 things coincided. One was in 1996, at the end of 1996, when George Puel, then a famous city councillor, became the chair of the GVRD. And simultaneously, my government downloaded 600 kilometers of then secondary provincial highways. We declassified them. And what that meant is that we no longer were responsible for those roads. The governments, the municipal governments at the regional level, were responsible for those. When I was reviewing the history of TransLink, and I saw that event, I remember that event greatly now, but I have since, for 20 years, I blocked that out of my mind because it was so contentious and really, let me say, cheeky on the part of, that's the nice word, cheeky on the part of our government for doing that. But at the time, we were having matters offloaded onto us from the federal government. Anyway, it's not a reason, but it is an excuse. So George Puel said his highest priority was transportation. And that came as a surprise to a lot of the bureaucrats in the GVRD, because transportation was a huge issue. There was gridlock in the Lower Mainland, but no one had articulated it as the highest priority until George Puel did. He also seized the opportunity of us downloading highways, declassified highways onto the regional authority to say, okay, now's the time. We're going to go to that GD provincial government and negotiate an authority that includes not only transportation, not only roads, but also public transit. Had it never been done before, it didn't exist. That kind of model didn't exist anywhere else. But he was going to do that. And I was the minister on the other side doing it. Let me tell you what let me quote from a historical document about what George and I said about each other. Remember, I was a New Democrat and George was NPA. However, the leading figures for the GVRD and the provincial government were at opposite ends of the political spectrum. George Puel's counterpart was Joy MacPhail, the NDP's minister responsible for transit. We're opposites in absolutely every respect, MacPhail said. He's curmudgeonly beyond belief. He is a straight shooter. Later on, I said, I quickly learned to feel a great deal of affection for him. I'm not sure whether we would have ended up as successfully as we did without George there. George on Joy MacPhail. When we started, the idea of meeting with her didn't agree with me at all, Puel admitted. Later on, the more we worked together, the more she grew on me, like some sort of scab. The more I realized how important she was in getting this deal done. I only say that because George championed on the side of the GVRD the creation of an authority that had never existed anywhere before, with a huge deal of pushback from his colleagues, his counterparts, and I faced the same thing at the provincial cabinet table as well. Neither of us had the goodwill of our own constituents, and we had to work greatly to achieve that goodwill. So, what was the idea behind TransLink? Why did we want to create it? Well, it had three key features that we were trying to achieve, and I say to this day, initially we did achieve these three key features. It was to be responsible for creating a transportation network to move people and goods efficiently, to build capacity for population growth, and to meet the municipality's economic plans. At the time, there was another document that was being developed and had huge support, and it was called the Livable Region Strategy that many of you may have studied or at least remember. Secondly, it was to be responsible for the major road network and for the public transit system, and as I said, that was a unique concept at the time. That collaboration under one roof did not exist anywhere else. And thirdly, it was to have the means to raise its own funds through taxation. And that was a key change from its predecessor, BC Transit. I was minister responsible for BC Transit, and every year I would have to go to the Treasury Board and appeal to them for funds annually. That simply did not lead to any proper planning. But a key feature of this new authority was to be that they were to have the ability to tax. And of course, we know, as recently as last year, the failure of the failure of that concept in a grand way when the referendum was imposed upon TransLink to raise money in the form of what was it, a half cent on the sales tax, imposed on TransLink by the provincial government, and the failure of the citizens to support that. Anyway, that was the concept, and initially those objectives were met. I would say that one of the other strategic achievements that we had hoped to succeed with on the provincial side, it was not shared by the GVRD, it was not opposed by the GVRD, but we had very strongly held views that this was supposed to be good for the people who ran the system. The working people, the people in the unions were supposed to be better off in a better working environment, a more coordinated working environment that worked well for the people delivering the services and those using the services. So, ultimately, in the negotiations, everything came down to money. How were we going to make this work in a way that was sustainable and forward-looking? How were we going to allow the TransLink, it was originally called GVTA, the Greater Vancouver Transportation Authority, but we renamed it TransLink. How was that going to be sustainable through raising its own funds? So the negotiators at the time, there was one key man on the GVRD side, Marvin Schaefer, and on the provincial government side, Bob Lingwood and Peter Cameron. They said that the key was that they had to identify stable revenue sources for any new entity, and they also had to figure out a way to make the new entity not responsible for past debt. Because there was still debt on the books from the Expo line, for instance, that was at that time over 10 years old. And both parties agreed that the new entity shouldn't be saddled with old debt. So eventually the negotiators agreed upon and recommended a formula that was sent to both the GVRD and to the provincial government. And that would have, the entity would have all the functions of BC Transit, the former BC Transit, within the GVRD, and it would have allocation of funding to the municipalities for capital improvements from the government of British Columbia, and for maintenance of major road work. It would have responsibility for transportation demand management programs for residents, and it would ensure that the services met the region's air quality objectives. You know, in those days, in 1996, 20 years ago, we didn't talk about sustainability. We did talk about the greening of the economy, and we did talk about environmental issues. But it was not with the same passion or urgency that we now face today. So I think that the TransLink, the concept of the GVTA or TransLink, was extremely forward-looking when it encompassed the mandate of air quality into this regional authority, as well as sustainability. The governance model was to be 15 elected officials, including mayors, councillors, and MLAs who represented it. The government promised to allocate 6 cents of tax room from our fuel tax, and that would be a major funding source. And then there was going to be parking sales tax revenue, and also the TransLink would have the ability to recommend other streams of income through taxation. But first of all, that would have to be approved by the board. The legislation, George went out and did his thing to get the approval on the GVRD side, to the extent that 70%, eventually 70% of the GVRD members ratified it, and I had to take it to cabinet and get it ratified. I won't tell you what the vote was there, but it was a close one. And then we introduced the legislation to make this a model that would be lauded around the world. And in retrospect, both parties said that the legislation was terrific. It delivered more than either party thought it could deliver, and in July 30th of 1998, it was signed into law. So that was the birthing of the TransLink. But I must tell you, it has had a great deal of change since that original concept. It started to go sideways at a very particular time in the political spectrum of our world here. Oh, I've got to wrap this up quickly. When in 2001 there was a change of government. And that was particularly significant to me because I was one of 2 MLAs left, and there were 77 Liberal MLAs on the other side. At the same time, and the Liberals, when in opposition, did not vote for the new legislation for TransLink, always badmouthed it. So there was a change in government, and during that change in government, the election, the bus drivers, you may recall, some of you who are old enough, went on strike. They went on strike on April 1, and the new government, not fans of TransLink, not fans of, I would say, working people that much, had to legislate the bus drivers back to work in 2001 in August. And why I mention that is because it created the public hated TransLink at that time because first of all, they didn't get to use the buses for SkyTrain was running, but as we know, it's an integrated system, and if you had to take a bus at any point, it wasn't available to you. So that was the beginning of a really tough time for TransLink. And yet it was a very important time because other matters were, they were working with the then Liberal government, current Liberal government, to develop a new governance model, which never came about until 5 or 6 years later. They were looking for new funding formulas, which didn't come about till 3 or 4 years later. And at the same time, they were saddled with the responsibility for, their mandate did not change. Okay, so that's the history. I know you want to ask a whole bunch of questions of all of us, but I will just say on the issue of TransLink, the future of TransLink. We have to have an integrated model of transit and transportation issues in the GVRD region. It doesn't work if you have people off building bridges that have nothing. Oh, wait a second, that's happening, isn't it? Somebody's building a bridge without getting any authority from the GVRD or TransLink or whatever. What's that bridge called? The Massey, is it going to be called the Massey Bridge, Harold? Are they going to name it after you, maybe? No, I don't think so. You can't have that kind of planning where one party is not working with the other parties. Also, we have to increase public transit. We need every single car off the road that we can possibly get off the road, and that means improved public transit, and that means regional planning for public transit. And you need to clear the highways so that we can have economic transportation of our goods to market, we still can't put on a bus. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joy, and if I could call our panelists back up, we can go. Oh, microphones, good. I think the program said I could ask a question, but I'm not going to. I've been yapping enough. I'm going to just open it up and let the audience begin. Maybe what you could do is just briefly identify yourself, and if you could keep your questions semi-brief, we'll see how we go. Anyone want to lead us off? Is that a microphone? No, that's not a microphone.
Yeah, there's 2 mics. So just step up to the mic.
I guess maybe for Harold on the agricultural note, in a lot of my studies I've interacted with folks from the BC sort of commerce side of things, BC Business Council folks sort of in those spheres, and the regional growth strategy there's a heavy emphasis on preserving an agricultural focus. Some folks in the commerce world would say, well, that's kind of a joke. You know, our GDP, agricultural exports are not, they're taking the export lens, right? Saying provincially we don't export a lot of agricultural products. So from an economic and commerce standpoint, what's the argument to be made to promote agriculture? You've made some salient points. I have my own reasons for countering that argument, but I just thought I'd put that challenge to you that might come from those in the commerce sort of economic sphere to the agricultural argument.
Yeah. Robin Sylvester made a comment to Metro Vancouver about 3 years ago at a conference we had and said, give me the 2,500 acres of farmland that I want and we will export all the food you need for Vancouver. My mayor suddenly became an ardent supporter of saving farmland, so along with the rest of my council. But we get that argument all the time. And the problem with that argument is that basically our farmers would like to sell to the local market. But when the change came back in 59, 60 at that time, through the 60s, when the processors left, there was no one here to process their products, so they started marketing their products to the United States. So we have the strange situation where we import products from California and we export products south as well, and we aren't providing our own food. The BC Ministry of Agriculture did a study that said we need to put 92,000 hectares of alluvial class 1 to 3 soils that can be irrigated back into production. Instead of that, we're removing those lands. But this comes from the ministry itself. They did a report on it in 2006 and said if we want to feed ourselves, and we should be because of what's happening in the world situation, that we have to start bringing our farmers back to producing food locally for the local people, and we have to convert golf courses and find other lands like the Peace River farmlands to put back into production. And that's the real problem we have.
I have a question. Yeah. I was just thinking about Robert Moses, the master builder of New York City, and the parkways that he created as a way to allow normal people, working people, access to parks. And so I was just wondering, between your agenda, Richard, and yours, Joy, with regard to public transportation and parks, if in your work that argument was ever voiced in this region, were highways a necessity in order to allow people more access to parks, or public transit for that matter? Was there ever that connection made?
Well, what I do remember is that the integration plan wanted to include green spaces and bicycle paths, cycling paths integrated, so that the roads would be used for, the ultimate goal for the roads would be to move for as much as possible for the transportation of goods to market. That was the long-term vision of what it was. And in fact, there are, particularly along the SkyTrain lines, there are green spaces all along that for public use, so that, and that's not exactly what Moses' vision was, but it was so that there would be not conflict between transportation of goods and the public use of green space.
Just if I could comment, I'm not a very expert student of Robert Moses, but we missed our opportunities in the late 50s, the idea of some parkways, some of the major highways becoming key routes and treated as recreational routes, not just transportation routes, arose. But when Highway 1 was built from Port Mann through, to my mind, any possibility was basically ignored. It followed the ridge line crudely. It wasn't set into the landscape, and by and large space wasn't retained along it. And as time goes on, the medians that were so attractive are being minimized or eliminated in some cases. But I'd also say that to some extent, if I was going to put a few $100 million into parkways, maybe I'd put it into land preservation in parks and protected areas. The densification of this region over time, particularly if we want to preserve open space, farmland and recreational and environmental lands, is going to be so intense that the more everybody will live close to one of these sites, the kind of 1 hour driving time will be a half-hour time, whether it's by transit or private car. Anyway, his grand vision, as I understand it, produced some tremendous motorways and some tremendous parks on Long Island, ones I've seen and so on. But I'd like to see we could do a little more to preserve the view shed of some of our major routes, but boy, just look at Highway 1 as it passes through Surrey into Langley. It's changing rapidly and becoming an urban and industrial corridor.
Excellent.
Gary Penway, North Van City. The history of the region seems to be fractured with differences of decision-making at the provincial and regional levels. And Joy, your description of working with George and resolving that new vision for TransLink, I wonder how much of that success resulted from the fact that you needed to spend time together? Because there have been so many instances of the Millennium Line, for example, was an NDP project that didn't align with the regional plan. It's not that it's just Liberals versus other things, or different. It's that it's unlikely that we'll ever have all levels of government with the same political affiliation. So the question is, how do you get different political affiliations to come together for a common purpose? And it seems to me that maybe we don't spend enough time together to build those connections. And I'm just wondering your thoughts about that, and just how much time you actually wound up spending with George and the other reps coming to a conclusion.
I think one of the reasons why it worked so well with George Pule and me is because we both suffer from a small person complex. He was very short, too. But no, I'm just kidding. George, don't say anything. It's very, personal relationships are extremely important. Meeting together are very important. We used to have meetings amongst all levels of government, elected officials at all levels of government. I think Gordon Campbell might have started that. Did he start that, Gordon? When he was mayor. And the federal, provincial, and municipal politicians would all meet together with an agenda, maybe twice a year. I don't think that occurs anymore. But those kinds of discussions are extremely important. One of the reasons why we developed, by agreement, the kind of governance structure that was decided upon in the first TransLink iteration was to have representatives from the provincial government on the TransLink board. MLAs, Lower Mainland MLAs, were assigned to the board, and to have mayors and councillors who had direct responsibility to their constituents. And that was the concept of the governance model, and I advocate that governance model to this day. It's not only important for the politicians to know each other, but it's important for those who use the transit and transportation mechanisms, that they have direct communication and accountability from the politicians running it.
Could I add 2 quick comments? One, the greatest barrier to communication is no communication. You never get to know the other person and really learn. You can trust them that they're serious. 2, it doesn't matter so much what government structures are. It's when they both have the same priority, magical things happen. And all the cynicism about government, the Freedom to Move plan was done in 90 days by provincial and regional authorities, for example. And there are a few other examples where the combination of priorities, regardless of structure, you found a way to do things, but you had to agree on what the mission was.
I think we have time for one more question before our break, so go ahead.
Hi, my name is Wes Regan. I'm a student here in urban studies and social planner with City of Vancouver. Firstly, thank you for the years and years of service that you've brought to the region and our municipalities, and I really enjoyed hearing all your presentations. I'm just curious, revisiting the TransLink comments earlier and about the failure of the plebiscite, and just how much, I'm curious to hear from you why we were able to get some of these regional, large-scale, projects done in the past, how you've seen the region change, the municipalities change. We hear about south of the Fraser versus north of the Fraser and some of the differences that the communities there have in terms of transportation, cars versus transit, whatever else. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of where you see things going in our region and how we might be able to get some of these larger things done moving ahead.
Well, I think that major, now again, remember, I'm retired and I can say these kinds of things. I think major transit because transportation projects are funded out of the provincial budget. I think transit projects should be funded, capital projects should be funded out of the provincial budget. And I also think that the federal government should step up soon and contribute as well. Because for the decades I was in government, the federal government didn't contribute hardly anything. They did start to contribute fuel tax around 2005 toward TransLink, but it wasn't until then that they did that. So I think it is, for capital projects, I think it's leadership from the provincial government that is necessary.
Yeah, if I could comment on it, to see the results when governments do work together, just look at the Canada line and what's doing to downtown Richmond. We had a low-level community, and we decided that if we're getting the Canada line and LRT, that we would save farmland by going up, and we're going up to the maximum, which is 14 stories under the airport flight path, but it's booming. We're now looking at ways of how we can expand the number of cars and the length of the loading bays, because it's too small. At the same time, the question earlier about highways, At my council meeting a week ago, we've looked into the old Railway Avenue right-of-way, which joins with the Arbutus corridor, which I showed you as one of the ideas years ago of having it back to LRT again. And we approved densification along that corridor at council a few weeks ago. And we're going through a process where we're coming up with a new zone, because over the years the council had acquired extra land along that right-of-way, and the new zone will be for light rail and parkway. So right now we've got biking and walking trails, and we're still hoping to get the LRT, so we'll have a parkway going right through Richmond. And maybe Vancouver, if they could figure out how to do it with Arbutus corridor, it would work there.
The boss said we can have one more question. Okay. Let me, oh, yeah, okay.
Hi, Tanya Paz, transportation consultant. Grew up south of the Fraser, live downtown now. Joy MacPhail, I guess this question is for you about TransLink governance and its changes over the years. If you could comment on that, because you kind of stopped at 2001 and the last bus strike. So, an appointed board, or now 2 token spots for mayors added. Can you comment on what you think it should be, or what's worked and hasn't? And also, you've already mentioned capital projects should be a provincial budget item, which was my other question.
And again, I'm freelancing here because I'm retired. It seems strange to me to change the model from a governance model where there was accountability between those managing the system and responsible for the system and their constituents, to one where it was a corporate model where they were independent directors and continue to be independent directors with, in my mind, no direct accountability to the people paying the taxes or using the system. They're all fabulous people, and they devote many, many hours of their life to running a very difficult system. And it was Mike Harcourt, a former premier of mine, who ran the process to choose the independent directors. But it just seems to me that the whole concept of the system was to take it out of provincial responsibility, because everyone said, why should I have to call Victoria when my bus is late or broken down, from the provincial responsibility to a regional responsibility, and then not have any regional accountability in a democratic way. Now, I understand that the GVRD, or the Metro Vancouver, is not elected directly. I do understand that. But the fact is that when we said mayors and councillors and MLAs would be the governance model, would comprise the governance model, we expected direct accountability. That doesn't exist. I also hear rumors where maybe there's a thought that it'll go back to being a provincial crown corporation again. Well, I guess there are cycles of things, but it's not a good model. Believe you me, it's not a good model. And I'll tell you why it's not a good model. For one particular reason, is because the people in Prince George get really upset when they have to pay for the buses in Surrey. And it just complicates the matter of the special needs and special circumstances we face in the largest urban entity in British Columbia. What was the other question? Oh, on paying. I know Minister Fassbender, whom I really don't know, is coming, or maybe he's here. Are you here? Yep. Are you? Okay. So, sir, I'm retired. I understand that. And you're not. So it's easier for me to say these things. But I came from a government where capital projects were funded out of the provincial budget. That's how the Millennium Line, when you read the history about the TransLink, it says, and a cost-sharing agreement on the Millennium Line was reached between the GVRD and the provincial government. The provincial government would pay 100% of the capital cost. Well, that's some cost-sharing agreement, isn't it? But I mean, we did fool around with where the line went, as someone referred to. So we paid for the capital projects. And I just think it's, when you're crossing regional boundaries, when you've got municipalities that may be at odds about why or when or where, it's the senior government role that should step up and smooth the way for that. And I include the federal government in that too.
I promised you a history lesson, and you got maps as well. So it met all of Peter Oberlander's requirements. I hope they met yours. Let me, on your collective behalfs, thank these folks for sharing really a lifetime of legacy and experience for this region, whether it's with regard to agricultural land reserve and preservation of agricultural land with Harold's comments, Rick establishing the regional park system, which is a wonderful legacy that continues to this day, and to Joy for starting us down a new adventure that our next speaker, the minister, will maybe describe some of the unfolding as it's going to go next forward. So our thanks you to all of you.
Thanks, and please feel free to stretch your legs, grab a coffee, and we'll be back here quite soon at 11:15. Thank you, that was fantastic.